welcome Nicolas for this third session of the three workshops that we had this year, introducing natural science to economists. So we had the first, a very broad introduction on remote sensing by Laurent Polidori, then 3 hours on water and hydrogeology by Vincent Allais. And so Nicolas will start a workshop of 9 hours, like 6 times 90 minutes, on remote sensing, trying to go from the physics and actually achieving a journey from the physics to the environmental data, and helping us as economists to understand how remote sensing information is produced and can be used in basically social science applications. So Nicolas is professor at the University of Paris in the Paris Interdisciplinary Energy Research Institute. Before that, he worked at PRODIG, another research unit of Paris University, but he also went to the CESBio in Toulouse, where Laurent Polidori was also at the time. He has some experience in Japan, in Yokohama, for instance. Nicolas teaches basically remote sensing in the geography department, so he's used to interact with non-physicists, I would say. Yes, we hope that we can learn quite a lot from what Nicolas is going to explain, and I'm sure that we will do. So Nicolas, forgive me if I forget to say something, but I guess the floor is yours. And yeah, just sorry, before giving you the floor, a very quick point. So if you have questions, do not hesitate to raise them. There will be some time also at the end of the lecture to raise questions. Yeah, Nicolas, you're free to manage the way you pick the questions. Okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks for the organization, also for the lecture. So just a few words about my own research. I'm working especially on using optical remote sensing for several topics that are almost all related to the seasonal variation of the way ecosystems are working, or hydrosystems. And my first topic was what is called the phenology, which is a seasonal variation of ecosystems in Siberia. And here in this picture, that was my first topic. In red, you can see some places in the central Russia, for example, where the spring is coming earlier and earlier, as revealed by optical remote sensing. And when I did that, it was in the idea of modeling the carbon exchanges between the ecosystem and the atmosphere. Since then, I joined the geography. Before that, I was in a more like physical, some labs, some laboratories on natural and physics science of environment. And then I joined in 2010, I joined a research lab in geography. And here I worked also on water resources. And with the same sort of data, of optical remote sensing data, I mapped the snow area in the mountain, in the Andes mountain in Argentina, to explain the discharge of the river in the oases where 2 million people are living, and in which activities rely on the water. So it relies on the water from the river, and the water in the river itself comes from the snow melt in the mountain. So in blue is the measurement here of the discharge in the river, and in red, in orange, is what we can do when we model the discharge from the remote sensing of snow. Third topic is in France, the crop phenology and rotations. So you can see here the same landscape, a small landscape, at 3 different dates. And what you see in these pictures is that you can map the amount of vegetation in each agricultural stand, how it changes in time. It changes in time for 2 reasons: because the crop is growing, and because the crops are shifting, which means they are organized in time in rotations. And last topic, just to introduce my work, is the forest cover. This is a Landsat image in Nepal, where you can see the forest in red, but when you see it, you can see there are some contrast in the image, which is the contrast is not due to the contrast in the vegetation. It is due to the relief, to the topography. So currently, I'm working on how to remove the topography effect in the image, and here you can see some correction of topography within the image in order to map the forest. So just these slides to introduce that. And as you can see, remote sensing, by definition, is about watching the Earth's surface from space. All the examples, the 4 examples I gave are about that. And what means watching? Watching, first of all, it means making a physical measurement. And I'm going to talk about physics. And when we have physical measurement, the other part of what is watching is to interpret the physical measurement to learn about the ecosystem, the atmosphere, or the ocean. So this is actually my way to present remote sensing, starting by the physics, because in my career, I started by the physics of measurement in general, then about remote sensing, and then to applications. So this plan is organized also because of that. There may be also some other way to present remote sensing as a whole. Probably some people coming from mathematics would do differently. Probably they would talk about deep learning or neural network. I will not do it in this presentation. So in these lectures, what we are going to do is to talk about physics of the different forms of remote sensing. And I will expose also some keys to extract information surrounded by uncertainties, a little bit like in economics, I think. But it's all about that. It's how to get information about the variables we want to get when we have a lot of sources of variation in the signal that are not related to the variable you want to study. If I made here a list of remote sensing. Probably, I'm not sure it's totally exhaustive actually, but there are different types of remote sensing that I'm going to expose. First, optical remote sensing. My research is involved in optical remote sensing. I will take a lot of time in the next lectures to talk about it. Second one is thermal remote sensing. Third one is passive microwave remote sensing. Next are radar remote sensing, LiDAR, and gravimetry. So they all rely on different physics, and they are able to provide different variables about the ecosystems or about the territory. But optical remote sensing, as I said, the different examples I gave before are related to that. They rely on optical remote sensing. And you can do a lot of things with remote sensing. I gave here 2 examples. On the top, you can study the position of clouds, and you can follow the clouds every 15 minutes. This is, of course, used for meteorological forecast or for climate studies. This is something that is totally operational, which means in the current life, a lot of activity rely on that, and it's a full developed technology. What you can do also is to follow the land cover of the land cover on some places of the Earth or everywhere on the Earth. Here is one example at 2 different years of the same forest that is under deforestation. So this is probably what everybody knows the most, optical remote sensing. Second one is thermal remote sensing. Thermal remote sensing is strongly related. Sorry? Is there a question? Thermal remote sensing is related to the temperature of the surfaces of the objects that we are studying. Here, in this picture, you can see the temperature of the a surface of the ocean. Once again, this is something that is totally operational, which means that every day, these sort of maps are made several times during the day, actually, and they are used as the input in the climate model to forecast the meteorology. Third one, passive microwave remote sensing. It works a little bit like the thermal remote sensing. I will come to the physics today of these two forms. And here, one example is about mapping the ice concentration at the pole, here in the Arctic Ocean. So first one, radar remote sensing. Radar remote sensing, for example, can be used to map the oil sheet in the sea or the flood in at some rivers. LIDAR is related to the height of the object. At the top here, you can see the height of the trees, the height of the soil. And one technique about LIDAR is that you can remove the high object to get the bottom. And when you do that, for example, if you remove the trees from the LIDAR image here, you can have an idea about the topography and also about archaeological ruins that you can find below the trees. And gravimetry is about weighting the object. So you don't give the height, you don't give the color, but you give how much it weighs. And here is a variation of the mass of the ice in Greenland over time. These different forms of remote sensing rely on different physics. And if I start with the bottom one, gravimetry is a little bit special compared to the other ones because it is not based on electromagnetic radiation. It is based only on the measurement of the trajectory of the satellite around the Earth. I will come to the details later today. The other forms rely on the measurement of the properties of electromagnetic radiation. When I say electromagnetic radiation, I include light. Light is electromagnetic radiation like other ones. If I subdivide this into different categories, I've got three categories of what is called passive remote sensing. Optical, thermal, passive microwave are based on a natural source of electromagnetic radiation. Radar remote sensing and LiDAR are active remote sensing. They are based on artificial source of electromagnetic radiation. I keep subdividing the different types of remote sensing. Optical remote sensing, it's about measuring the light that is reflected, the light from the sun that is reflected by the surface. In the thermal and passive microwave, the radiation is natural and the source of the radiation is the object itself, the surface. In radar remote sensing, the electromagnetic radiation is emitted by an antenna, and in LiDAR, it is emitted by a laser. So basically, it's all about, except gravimetry, it's all about measuring the properties of electromagnetic radiation. So an electromagnetic radiation is its definition. It's the simultaneous vibration of an electric field and a magnetic field. So basically, it's not very helpful definition. What you can keep in mind is that electromagnetic radiation include light from the sun, light from any warm object, like a lava flow, for example. The light, it includes also the light from a laser or the light from antenna, which means the same sort of technologies and Wi-Fi, mobile phone, any antenna used for radio communication. Everything here has got the same nature, but they have different wavelengths. So wavelengths is a key point. Wavelength, its definition is the distance between two homologous points in the propagation of the light or the radiation. So the radiation is propagating in some direction with some speed. At 2 points in space, we have exactly the same properties. The wavelength is the distance between these two. There is a relationship between the frequency of the vibration, between the wavelength and the speed of light in vacuum. In remote sensing, we use 3 big domains of wavelengths. The first one is visible. What we can see with it's called visible because we can see it with our eyes. Its wavelengths are approximately included between 0.4 microns and 0.7 microns. Just after this, we use infrared. And infrared is from 0.7 to 15 microns approximately. But infrared is a too broad category. We will divide it later between near infrared, shortwave infrared, and thermal infrared. And finally, there is another spectral band, let's say, or a spectral domain that is used, which are the long wave, like they are called in French hyperfréquences. So they have wavelengths above 1 centimeter. So if I come back to my to the previous slide here, but this time with the wavelengths, what we can see is that all the forms of remote sensing use different wavelengths. And here I give the value of the wavelengths for each type. For optical remote sensing, all the forms use different wavelengths. What you can see is that the passive microwave remote sensing and the radar remote sensing use approximately the same wavelengths. The reason why we use different wavelengths in the different forms of remote sensing is that there are at least 3 reasons for that actually. First of all, they are not sensitive to the same things. The small wavelengths, like the ones that are used in optical remote sensing or LiDAR, are sensitive to the chemical constitution of the materials that are under studies. In these wavelengths, the light interact mostly with the chemical bonds that form the molecules. These bonds absorb the light, and the molecule can vibrate, for example, when the light is absorbed by the molecule. On the contrary, when we use large wavelengths, like in radar or like in a passive microwave, these wavelengths are sensitive to the dielectric properties of the material. Dielectric properties is the electric behavior of the material when they receive the radiation. For example, water is an insulator. When the water receives the electromagnetic radiation, this radiation is not transmitted inside. But the water molecule can align, can turn, and what happens is that the water, because of the electric property of the molecules of water, the radiation go back from the water and propagate in the medium where it comes from. So the different wavelengths interact with the matter in a different manner. So they carry information these wavelengths carry different information on what is the matter. The second reason why we use different wavelengths is that the small wavelengths, like in optical remote sensing, is disturbed by the atmosphere. But the large wavelengths are not. So when we study one environment where there is a lot of clouds, for example, or where there is a lot of pollution of these sort of things, probably it's better to use large wavelengths. There is a question in
Yes, well, I didn't want to interrupt. That's why I put the question in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So today I will expose what is the thermal remote sensing.
Okay. Maybe now that it's stopped, I just asked the question. I didn't get exactly the difference between optical and thermal, because you said that thermal, it's the radiation emitted by the object itself.
Yes.
But I was asking, isn't it also solar light that is reflected? It's isn't it first absorbed, then re-emitted? So I didn't.
No. It's
No?
the surface itself emits some light only simply because it has got a temperature which is above 0 degree Kelvin. So,
Okay, but it's also related to the solar light at first. I mean, no.
yeah, because the solar light just
Yeah.
the whole system, but it's not because of the solar light that is coming directly to the surface, basically.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
So the second reason why it's interesting to have different wavelengths in different type of remote sensing is that some are protected from being disturbed by the atmosphere, the ones using large wavelengths. And a third reason is that with small wavelengths, it's easy to get high spatial resolution, and whereas with large wavelengths, it's difficult. So if you need high spatial resolution, it's better to use forms of remote sensing with small wavelengths. Even though with radar remote sensing, there are some technologies that allows to have large or high spatial resolution. And I will come back to that. So basically, what I want to say here is that by using different forms of remote sensing using different wavelengths, you can have access to different information, and some of them must be preferred in certain conditions. So in the following, I will develop mostly optical remote sensing and radar remote sensing, the ones I know the better. But today I will talk more about thermal remote sensing, passive microwave remote sensing, LiDAR, and gravimetry. So just some words about optical remote sensing, a very short summary, and I will make a full presentation later. So optical remote sensing is all about that. We have a sensor on a satellite. We have the sun, which is a primary source of energy, and the sun enlighten the surface with white light, which is made of different wavelengths. And the sensor measures the energy of the light that is reflected. For example, a green object, by definition, is an object that reflects a lot of green light in the green wavelengths. Optical remote sensing use visible wavelengths, near infrared, shortwave, infrared. And what we can do with optical remote sensing is, for example, to map the type of the surface, which means we can map the land cover. We can go to land use also, or we can map disasters. And there are a lot of things more we can do. We can also map the state or evaluate the state of the surface. If we know we are talking about vegetation, we can study its phenology, or we can study the density of vegetation. And the topic I will talk about how to do that. And also in the next lecture, I will develop how to deal with the effect of topography in the images of the atmosphere and the effect of the directional effect. The directional effect is, for example, when the satellite is not watching from here, but watching from here. The measurement is not the same. So how I will tell about this effect. Optical remote sensing works from high, which means 1 meter resolution, to low spatial resolution, about 1 kilometer. So I will show some examples at this different spatial resolution. Just to introduce radar remote sensing, clarify the difference between the different forms, but I will come back to that extensively later on. Radar remote sensing is about having a sensor on the satellite that is made of a dual antenna. One antenna is to emit radiation to the surface, and another one is to measure the properties of the light that comes back to the satellite. The wavelengths are big, from 1 centimeter to 60 centimeters. And one consequence of that is that the radar remote sensing is not at all affected by clouds. The radar radiation is totally unaffected by clouds. And I will expose the piece of physics that explains why radar remote sensing, with the same principle, can map clouds, ocean height, wind speed, or again, deforestation. So I will tell you about that in the next lecture. So today, my plan is to develop on the other forms of remote sensing, starting by gravimetry. Gravimetry is a form of remote sensing that is totally different from the others because it does not rely on the measurement of an electromagnetic radiation or of light. The principle is to monitor the spatial and temporal variation in gravity. What means gravity? What is gravity? It is the acceleration due to the attraction by Earth. If we have a very simple instrument like this one at the bottom right of the slide, which is a spring here with a certain mass, a small mass. So you just take it by the top and you see what happens. Because the mass is attracted by the center of Earth, by the Earth, the spring becomes longer. And this is the way that historically gravity is measured. And the point is that gravity is not the same everywhere on Earth. And if you take the same small instrument here and you position it at different places on Earth, you don't get the same measurements. At the North Pole, the gravity has got some value. At the equator here, it is smaller. So everywhere on Earth, the gravity is different. If Earth was a perfect homogeneous sphere, gravity would be spatially constant. But the gravity is not the same everywhere on Earth because of the differences in altitude or material density, for example. So this is something, so what are the objectives of gravimetry? First, the objective is to refine what is called the geoid. For those of you who manipulate geographical data under QGIS or any GIS system, you must have heard about what is a geoid. Geoid is, I will define later, but it is used to position. Geoid is sometimes simplified by ellipsoid, and it's used to position objects at the Earth's surface. So, first objective is to refine the geoid. Second is to map the spatial variation in gravity. In order, for example, to get a measurement of the density of material below the Earth's surface. Gravimetry is the only form of remote sensing, spatial remote sensing, that can give us information about what's going on 100 kilometers below the Earth's surface. So this is used for research in geophysics to study the internal Earth structure, but it is also used for geological prospection, like exploration for oil. I will come back to that later. Beside spatial variation in gravity, there are other changes that can be mapped and studied. It is the temporal change of gravity. Why gravity changes over time? For example, when the amount of liquid water is changing across the season. When the ice sheets is changing, or to study the current over the ocean. So first, let's talk about geoid. This sort of work is known for a very long time. Like Bouguer studied these sort of things in the 18th century. Of course, not using spatial gravimetry, but using the small instrument I was talking before, which is the spring and the mass at the bottom part of the spring. And using this small instrument, what did Bouguer was to study the direction of what is called the vertical. So, which is a very strange sentence, but we can understand what is vertical when we do that. If you use the spring here, if you are here, the spring, the direction of vertical is you can understand it naturally. So the spring go at the bottom. But then, if you are somewhere else here, the mass that is linked to the spring is slightly attracted by the mountain that is present in the landscape. So this vertical here is not parallel to this vertical. Gravity is a vector. Gravity is oriented by this vertical. So here it means G here and G here are not parallel. What is ellipsoid? Ellipsoid is a line that is always, by definition, geoid is a line that is perpendicular to all the verticals, which means the geoid is somewhere here, but the geoid is somewhere like that. So in a slightly different direction. So now, if we look over the Earth, geoid has got this sort of forms. The geoid is a line, if we take a 2D representation, it is a surface, in fact, if we take a 3D representation, that is perpendicular to G passing through the ocean surface. So over the ocean, the geoid is the ocean surface. And the strange thing, when we consider what I said here, is that the vertical all the verticals are not parallel, that if we look to the ocean the altitude of ocean over the whole surface, ocean is not plane. If there is some mountains if there are some mountains below, on the surface below the water, then there will be a small deflection over the surface, simply because this point is attracted by this mountain below water in this direction, in this direction. So the ocean surface is not totally plane, and it follows this. It follows the topography that is below the ocean. So what is the geoid? Over the ocean, the geoid is strictly equal to the surface of the ocean. Over the land surface, the landforms, it follows this definition, and it passes on average in the altitude of the ocean. So basically, this is a concept that is a bit complicated to imagine, but it is necessary for geodesy. Geodesy is the science of geographical data positioning. So we need geoid to design ellipsoid, and ellipsoid are usually used as a reference to organize geographical data. I come back to this example, like here is the topography below the ocean. If there is a mountain of 1 kilometer, it will translate into a small deviation here of the ocean of 1 meter. So it is a small amount. If you have a subduction zone, the same. 5 kilometers, it will be a deflection of 3 meters. So basically, the geoid over the ocean is not totally flat, but still the deflection are very small. But this is this sort of thing that spatial gravimetry wants to map. How spatial gravimetry works? First of all, it uses satellites that are in orbit. Of course, satellites are going around the Earth. The altitude of these satellites is rather low compared to other forms of remote sensing, because the altitude of the satellite must be influenced strongly by the changes of the gravity. The trajectory is influenced by the local gravity field in terms of strength and in terms of direction. So basically, because the gravity field of Earth is not spatially constant, the trajectory of the satellite around the Earth is not a perfect circle. So the whole principle of gravimetry is to be able to follow the trajectory of this satellite around the Earth to derive the changes, the changes in the local gravity field in terms of strength and in terms of direction. So in order to follow the trajectory, there are two types of measurements that the satellites use. First, there is a precise measurement of the satellite position using the GPS. And also, there are measurements of the acceleration of the satellite in the three directions. As far as I know, there are two big missions of gravimetry, the family of GRACE and Gautier. So, first of all, GRACE. GRACE is a couple of two satellites. They look like that. One satellite, two satellites. They are separated by 220 kilometers, and they go around the Earth. They are equipped by accelerometers, which means accelerometer is an instrument to measure how the change of speed in this direction, and this direction. Also, there is a measurement of the distance between the two satellites. Because the trajectory changes, the distance is not constant. So this is also known. The second satellite is Gautier. Gautier was looking like that. It's not working anymore. It has been working during 3 years after mission completion. It is an instrument that is a satellite equipped by an instrument that is called a gradiometer, which is in fact a group of 6 accelerometers. So basically, the acceleration, which means the the changes of direction of the satellite were measured very precisely. And also, there was a constant measurement of positioning of the satellite around the Earth. So these are the two satellites, and now we will see what the sort of measurements that they make. So here is a representation of the maps of gravity field as measured by GRACE. And what you can see here is that it looks like there are some bumps over the Earth because some part of the Earth have got different altitude or different density. This map of gravity has been derived to measure the geoid. And you can see the geoid anomaly are measured in millimeters. And what you can see here is that over the ocean, the geoid, which means the surface of the ocean, is not totally flat. There was another geoid that was produced from Gautier. And here you can have a representation of this geoid. You can see some very strong bumps that are, of course, over-contrasted.
Excuse me, I'm just may I ask a question? And you distinguish between altitude and density because it depends on what the mountains are made of? Or?
Yes, yeah. even if it's flat, the density of different rocks are different. So even over a flat surface, you can have changes of density that explain difference of gravity. So it is always a mixture between altitude, topography, and density and material density.
So Nicolas?
Yes.
Just to build up on that, like how far is it sensitive? Like, I mean, like suppose like you have seasons, then of course it rains more in some part of the year. So you have the monsoon in South Asia, for instance. Would it pick like the fact that you have more rainfall and more water in rivers and so on? Or suppose China is building like a big dam. Does it affect like the gravity up to a point where you would spot it on the geoid?
Yes, it does. And I will show some slides about studies, hydrological use, the use of gravimetry for hydrology. So I will show some example. Not in China, but I think what you mentioned with dam is possible for big ones. So this geoid here is planned. I'm not sure actually it has been used to update because it's not so old. So I don't think it has been used yet to modify the ellipsoids that are used as a reference. I think not yet. But this geoid from Gautier is now used as the reference surface to analyze the height of the ocean. Because another type of remote sensing, which is called radar altimetry, I will present that in the lecture about radar, needs a perfect knowledge about the position of the satellite, which needs itself a perfect knowledge about the geoid. So the geoid from Gautier is used to improve the interpretation of altimeters to study the effect of climate change on the ocean altitude. So now, François, so I will come to what you mentioned just before. I took some applications that from the literature, and this one I really like. It's quite a beautiful one. So you all know that the Aral Sea is exposed to a very strong reduction in the quantity of water in the sea, in the area of the sea, due to the use of water for agriculture. So basically, here, what you can see in this top figure here is the measurement of the mass of water in the Aral Sea over time. So gravimetry is about that. It's about measuring, because it measures gravity changes, it can measure the mass of the object. And what you can see here, since 2003, you can see the variation of the mass of water over the season. You can see some seasonal variation, of course, but you can see also some long-term trends, like a slight reduction in the mass of water that is due to the use of the water. When this signal is simplified, so it means average over several acquisitions, you can see very, very well the seasonal cycle and the long-term trends in the mass of water of the Aral Sea. This in red is another indicator which comes from the optical remote sensing. So it is the surface of the Aral Sea. And of course, the mass of water and the surface of water is correlated. In this figure from the same article, we have a comparison with another form of remote sensing I was talking just before, and I will expose more longer later, which is the radar altimetry. Radar altimetry is about measuring the height of water. So it means in these two slides, we have a combination of three types of remote sensing: optical remote sensing to get the surface of the sea, altimetry to get the height of the sea, and gravimetry to get the mass of the sea. And what you can see is that we can also find, with using the altimetry, we can find the same decline in the height of water, the same as we found in the gravimetry, in the mass of water. And here we are in another application which is very strongly related to what you mentioned, François, just before, which is the mass of water linked to the seasonal variation. And here you can find the Amazon River. Yeah. And of course, there is some seasonality in the precipitation, and you can find it here. You don't have the same mass of water all across this. I think it's a couple of years actually. It's about maybe one. No, sorry, it must be only 1 year. So you can find the difference in mass of water, the difference of gravity expressed as mass of water, and itself expressed as centimeter of water. So the color is centimeter of water. So you can find where the mass of water in the Amazon basin across the seasonal variations. Now, and I think, yeah, this is quite directly related to purely environmental data that are needed for studying the resources. Other type of study that is done with gravimetry is the study of the internal geophysics. And especially one big objective of Gautier was to map the discontinuity of Morovici, which is the limit in the lithosphere, the limit between the upper mantle and the crust. So basically, this mission has allowed to map over the Earth a discontinuity that is approximately 100 kilometers below the Earth's surface, to map it precisely. So, of course, this is used for research in geophysics, but it has got also some potential applications. Like, for example, this discontinuity and, in general, the Gautier measurement are sensitive to the density. And the density is sensitive to something else that is sensitive to the temperature of the object. So basically, Gautier allowed to map in 3D the isotherms, which are the surface of similar temperature below the Earth's surface. Here you can find, there is here this green surface is approximately between 20 and 40 kilometers. But it allows to map the isotherms of 1,100 degree approximately at 100 kilometers below the Earth's surface. So it maps the isotherms. And the point is that from these isotherms are direct input to model the presence of oil, of hydrocarbon, and especially mapping the maturity is directly linked to the maturity of hydrocarbon that is dependent on the temperature. So there have been some operational usage of Gautier in terms of internal geophysics to better evaluate the maturity of the oil field below the Earth's surface.
So yes. Again, to link it to environment, like to economic application. Using that, is it sufficiently precise to estimate like the depletion of oil stocks? If, like, suppose you have oil stocks which are shared between different companies, is it something that?
No, I think I think this is not. I don't think this can be used like that. It has
Okay.
it had been used to qualify the, let's say, the quality of the oil that is present, not the extraction. I don't think. I think it's not as precise as that. And one reason for that is the spatial resolution is very low, about 100 kilometers.
Okay, thanks.
So a last example about gravimetry is the melt of snow, and especially the mass change. I showed already some picture before about the mass of ocean. And of course, now you can see that because gravimetry is sensitive to the mass, it can be used to map the ice melt over the pole in Antarctic, here in Antarctic. And it can be used not only to map the dispersion in terms of surface, but in terms of mass. And it was quantified here as, for example, the dispersion of 67 gigaton of every year in this area of the Antarctic. So it is sensitive enough to do that, but not sensitive enough to do what you were suggesting. So, on conclusion, on gravimetry, it is used for hydrology, ice science, geology, and it's very different from the other types of remote sensing because there is no measurement of electromagnetic field. The very good point is that the datasets are already available. It is available. Actually, the processing of this is very complex because it's about reconstructing the trajectory of a satellite over the years and translating it into difference of mass. But this is done by different teams of the at different locations in the world. And if I come back to a slide before here, you can find here 3 names. I didn't talk about that, but they are called Solution of Grace from 3 different teams, and these teams provide freely and on the same website their own estimation of the temporal changes of gravity expressed in centimeters of water. So it means, as a primary interpretation, water and hydrology is really what is targeted. And actually, it's quite easy to use at all. Myself, I used it a little bit when I analyzed the relationship between the snow cover in the on mountain and the water discharge in the river in arid Argentina. I did it with a simple linear relationship, and I analyzed the residuals of this relationship using the measurement of mass in order to approximate the variation of the height of the snow in the mountain. So this is a very small experience with gravimetry, but in Université de Paris, there is the Institute of Geophysics, IPGP, and here there are several people working on that. So if someone needs some more information about how to use gravimetry, I think there are a lot of people in Paris able to answer. So let's.
Excuse me, and I have a question. This gravimetry, it goes back how many years? So the watermark was back 2000?
2003.
You have data, how far could you go back?
From 2003 to now for Grace. And Gautier was only a 3 years mission, and I think it was from 2009 to 2012. There is next generation of Grace that is under preparation or already launched. but the time series are completed. So from 2003, you can have the anomaly of changes, the anomaly of mass, but not before.
Excuse me, also have a question.
Yes.
Have you seen any application of these data sets for detecting floods, either with gravimetry or another technique?
Cloud, I think gravimetry is not efficient for cloud because the spatial resolution is not very strong. You can do better for mapping flood, but what I've done with gravimetry is that I study in Siberia. I study the effect of the snow melt at spring, and in Siberia the rivers are flowing from the south to the north. So the snow melts earlier in the south than in the north. So it means that the water becomes liquid in the south of the Siberia. It moves towards the north, and then it is blocked by ice. So you have strong accumulation of water, and this somewhere in the north. And this we could find it in the gravimetry in the gravimetry data. But I think if you want to study flood, radar remote sensing is much more adapted, and I will echo the physical principle of this later. You can use also optical remote sensing, but optical remote sensing very often when there is a flood, there is also some clouds, and with optical remote sensing, you will be very much annoyed with clouds. So to answer, yes, you can study flood, but I think there is better to study. There is some other forms of remote sensing are more adapted.
Okay, thank you.
So now I move to next type, which is LiDAR. So LiDAR is based on a laser. So what is a laser? It is an instrument. It is based on the stimulated emission by molecule, stimulated emission of light by a molecule. It is based also in what is called a Fabry-Perot cavity, which amplify the radiation that is emitted. Anyway, a laser is an instrument that is able to produce a light that is monospectral, only one wavelength. It allows to make some light in a very fine parallel beam. And in the lasers that are used in remote sensing are about 1 micron wavelength. So the whole principle of LiDAR is to emit a pulse of light to the surface. A part of this light is reflected and come back to the instrument. And the thing is to measure the time that is necessary to do this too well. So when the object is high, the time is smaller than when the object, for example, the surface, is low. So basically, when there is a pulse of light here, a part of the light will take some time to come back, and another part will take a little bit longer. So we can have an idea of the distribution of height within the area. Here is one example of a cloud of points over some area. It is made by a drone. So LiDAR is often used with a drone or planes. So you can have a cloud of LiDAR points, which looks like that. What you can do is to reconstruct the topography of an area. And here are the examples that I have already showed before. So this is the whole point of cloud. Some points can be isolated as the points that are high. And if we remove them, we can keep only the points that are low, and we can find some structure below the trees. So here, some archaeological ruins. Here, in this example, you can find. In this example, you can see optical remote sensing here, image, and here is a LiDAR image at the same place, and the same exercise as here has been done. The points related to the forest or to the trees are removed. And when you remove that, what you can find is some strange lines. And these lines are labors, so agricultural, I don't remember in English the word, like when you dig the soil before to prepare the soil to prepare the soil to prepare the soil to receive some new plants. And this ploughing here was made during the first of second century after Jesus Christ, so about 2,000 years ago. And since then, this area has been covered by forest. So this example, once again, comes from LiDAR data on one plane or one drone. And all the previous slides were about LiDAR equipped drone or airplanes. But now there are some LiDARs that are mounted over satellites. ICESat-2, for example, whose main target is to measure the ice height over areas like Greenland. But also it will be used to measure the vegetation, the height of the vegetation. And it has actually, but the data is not processed yet, a 100-meter resolution. There is another LiDAR that has been launched, which is called Destiny, that has been built to study the ecosystem and especially the carbon stocks over the ecosystems by being sensitive to the height of the vegetation. So, is there any question about LiDAR before I go to thermal and passive microwave?
What is the precision of the height of the vegetation?
Well, this
is it just big trees?
I think with a drone, the precision is very high, but I'm not able to quantify it. But it actually, some LiDAR works with it must depend over the density of point of LiDAR. If I come back to this slide here, if you have a lot of pulses for each square meters, you will be able to differentiate this point from this point from this point. But if you have a low density of pulses over each square meter, you may not be sensitive to this point, but only to this one. So it will depend over the density of points. So, and this is adjustable. This is adjustable because if your objective, if you have a drone equipped with a LiDAR, is to cover a big area and you've got a few days to make your measurements, then you will have you need to have a smaller density that if you study only a small area. So it depends on the setting parameters of the experiment, and it depends on the user actually. But if you have a big density of points, I think the precision about the height is very good.
Sorry, I also have a question.
Yeah.
So when you say to measure, to describe the ecosystem, the last
yes.
satellite, so what elements of the ecosystem?
It's essentially height and density, and this will be expressed also as a carbon density in order to measure biomass. But this is using allometric equation to relate the height to the carbon weight or to the biomass.
The quantity of wood and
yeah, the wood, the dry biomass.
Okay. Thank you.
So now let's go to the last two forms of remote sensing, and I group them because they rely on the same physics. They only differ by their wavelengths. So these are thermal and passive microwave remote sensing. And before there was a question about the difference between the light that is emitted and the light that is reflected. And here we can see what is the light that is emitted by the object. If you look at a core here during the night with a thermal camera, you can see the core if you look in the good wavelengths, in the wavelengths that are adapted. Why? Because the core is well, it's a bit sad for the core to say like that, but it's a warm object, and the temperature of the surface of the core is different. Like in the eye, the temperature is higher than here, for example.
Yes, my question was related to the Earth's surface temperature when it is related to the reflectance of the solar radiation. So infrared related to, so not the thermal radiations related to the heat produced by the object, but the one related to the warming of the Earth's surface related to the solar radiation.
Yeah, okay.
In that case, how do you do the distinction? That was my question.
Okay. One way to do it is to use thermal infrared remote sensing at night. So you don't have the direct contribution of the solar light. Okay. But still, the surface has been warmed up during the day by the light. So it is the temperature of the object. So the temperature of the object depends on the amount of light that has been received over the last hours, let's say, or last days. It depends also of the temperature of the air, of the atmosphere. So it is a combination of both.
Yeah, indeed. It would be true also for cold blood animals, I guess.
Sorry?
It might be also the case for cold blood animals.
Yeah.
Actually heat themselves with the solar radiation. So
their temperature must be quite close to the temperature maybe of the air. I guess.
Maybe. I don't know if it would be interesting to check the global warming.
So yeah, basically here, the thermal remote sensing measures the temperature of the object, but does not tell you why this temperature is, why this object has got this temperature. It gives you information about the temperature. So
thank you.
All what we have to keep in mind is that all objects, as long as they are above 0 degree Kelvin, so which means every object, emit some light naturally. So it is obvious, it is the case for this core. It is more obvious when we are looking to lava. We can see the light emitted by the lava with our eyes. And there has been a lot of experiments to understand this. A lot linked with the industry of iron, for example, in the 19th century. So a lot of research was carried out in the second part of the 19th century about that, and there was no physical grounds to explain the fact that each object can emit some light only with a distribution in terms of wavelengths that depends only on its temperature. And at the end of the 19th century, it was empirically solved by Planck. And this theory was further explained by Einstein by introducing quantum physics. So basically, the equation of Planck received some analysis from Einstein a few years later by introducing the fact that the energy of light can be divided in small quantity, quanta, and each of these small quantity can be directly related to the wavelengths, which means that for a certain wavelength, you can have a discrete level, some discrete levels of energy, but you cannot have intermediate levels of energy. And this was necessary to explain explain the emission of energy, the emission of light by this object. This further was explained by Bohr and Rutherford when they introduced the fact that electrons go around the central part of the atoms at certain orbitals, so at certain distance. So it's this curve is very important for this thermal part, for this to get to understand the thermal remote sensing. And this is very much a piece of physics that was done at the boundary between the 19th and the 20th century. And the Planck's law tells us that the quantity of energy that is emitted by a theoretical body that is called a black body, in French, corps noir. This is why I kept here the two letters CN, but it is the quantity of energy under the form of radiance of the black body for a certain wavelength depends only, only one thing, on the temperature of the black body. Here we find again the wavelengths. H is a constant. C is the speed of light, another constant. So the quantity of energy emitted depends only on the temperature of this black body. What we can see also in the Planck, in this figure, is that the quantity of light, the energy of the light that is emitted by an object, so depends directly on the temperature, and the warmer the object is, the bigger the amount of energy is. So an object at 6,000 Kelvin emits more than one object at 3,000 Kelvin, whatever the wavelength. But one object at 6,000 Kelvin will emit will have a maximum of energy at a wavelength of 0.6 microns. And one object at 3,000 Kelvin will have a maximum of energy at 1.2 microns. So and this is why actually our eyes are adjusted to the energy of light that is emitted by the sun, because the surface of the sun has got this temperature. So the maximum of light, the maximum of emission by the sun is located between 0.4 and 0.7 microns, and our eyes are adapted to this. So our peak of sensitivity of our eyes is adapted to this. So now, if I come back to that, this is the same Planck's law, but with different scales, with logarithmic scales. So in this figure, what you can see is that the sun, the lava, the core, the ground emit some light directly as an application of this law. So even the optical remote sensing rely on this emission as the primary source of light is the sun. So basically, the thermal and passive microwave is about measuring this quantity of energies of the that is emitted by the surface itself. So from that, there are some easy applications, let's say. And until here, the different slides I show are can be applied to thermal remote sensing and passive microwave remote sensing. Now I go back to a few slides only related to thermal remote sensing. And in these two slides, in these two pictures here, what you can see are the images from Landsat. And Landsat is an optical remote sensing instrument, but it is equipped with one spectral band that is at 12 microns wavelength, which means it is located in the thermal emission domain. What you can see here in this image is this thermal band image over the Etna. Here is the top part, the summit of the Etna. And what you can see is some very bright pixels that are the lava flow, that are related to the lava flow. Here, it is exactly the same, but in the 6th August. And this image was acquired at night, during the night time, and not, so what you see is not a mix of what is reflected and what is emitted, it's only what is emitted. So what you can see in this thermal, this small application of thermal remote sensing is that we can detect very warm objects like this one. And I can introduce one issue about optical and thermal remote sensing is that it is sensitive to the presence of cloud. Here, the black forms, here are clouds, and when there is a cloud, we cannot see the lava flow. It's totally covered. What we can see here also is that some pixels are brighter than others. This is related to the age of flow of the lava flow. This is, for example, 1 day. This is 5 days, 5-day lava flow. So it has already cooled down. Other applications of thermal remote sensing is the detection of fire. And here you have something that I directly downloaded over this website. I have downloaded the position of fire that are detected by the MODIS thermal spectral band over a few days here in Africa. So I could download the KML, the position of the fire, and put it in Google Earth, and to make this figure. So this is directly done. You can download it directly. You can access to the last few days archive, but you can also have access to the fires over the last about 20 years position of fire. Again, as in the previous example, this is based on thermal infrared. So it means if there is a cloud, you don't see the fire. You miss the fire. It cannot be detected if there is a cloud above it. So these are for easy applications. Easy, let's say. More difficult is to measure the temperature by itself, because most of the surface are not black bodies. Most objects don't purely respect the law introduced by Planck. This is theoretical. This is for a theoretical object, which is called a black body. But most objects are not black body. Most objects are gray body. It means that they emit a quantity of water that is smaller than the quantity of energy, that is smaller than the quantity of energy that is emitted by a black body. Epsilon here is emissivity, and emissivity is a fraction from 0 to 1. So emissivity reflects the fact that objects do not behave like a black body.
Can you give us the kind of intuition why there is this the prediction of emission?
Intuition about why objects are not black bodies?
Yeah. Yes.
No, I cannot like that. Some objects can approximate black bodies, and As I said before, in the 19th century, there was some experiment about that. So experiment means measurements. So it means that some objects must have been black bodies. And in order to approximate a black body from with real materials, the scientists use what is called a cavity. A cavity is a sort of block of metal, but inside the metal there is a big hole. So it means if we warm this cavity, all the molecules in this in this object will emit, but some of the molecules will emit inside the cavity. So the light that is emitted will contribute to the warming of the object by itself. So if we take this, and so this allows to make some measurements. So if we take this, it means that most of the other bodies emit some light, but that does not contribute to the warming of the object. So it means that there must be some laws to explain this. Maybe. So I cannot tell you more about why emissivity of most materials do not behave to like a theoretical object. It is, I only know it's a fact actually.
Okay, so when you took the sun as an example, it's not a black body in itself, like.
It is almost a black body.
It's almost a black body. Okay.
Yeah. For sun is working like a black body. And the light from the sun is a little bit different from the. Actually, no. The chromosphere of the sun is a black body, which is a layer of the sun that emits most of the light that we receive. But around the sun there is a small atmosphere also, and this atmosphere slightly modify the light that it receives from the more internal part of the sun. But sun. We can really at least sun is almost a black body.
Okay.
So emissivity is a problem actually for thermal remote sensing, because if our objective is to estimate T, the temperature from this, we need to have only constant in this equation. Wavelength, we know it because it is we decided for the experiment. H and C are constant, K also. But then if we introduce emissivity before this equation, then we introduce a second variable, which means there is an infinity number of possible solutions of couples between emissivity and temperature. So if we want to derive the temperature from the measurement of the radiance, we need to know the emissivity. And somehow it's working. I already showed this picture here. It is the sea surface temperature, SST, over the whole planet that is derived from a NOAA EVHRR sensor. So why it's working? It's because over water, emissivity is known and it's almost homogeneous. So if we know emissivity, we can derive the temperature from the radiance. It's not so easy or not so direct, because what is measured by the sensor on the satellite is a sum of what is emitted by the water and what is emitted by the atmosphere itself. So basically, there is two contributors, so we need at least two equations to solve, to know what is the temperature of the surface. So basically, what is done to measure the temperature of the sea surface is to use the measurement in two spectral bands directly located in the thermal domain in order to make a two-equation system. But this is working and this is operational, and every day a lot of these maps are done several times a day, and they are used as input in the meteorological model. Over land, it's much more difficult because emissivity depends on the land cover. So some people develop some methods to measure the surface temperature from the thermal band by using a land cover map to approximate the emissivity. But emissivity depends also on the soil moisture or on vegetation density. So some people use some indicator of vegetation density like NDVI, I will come back to that later, or need some estimation with other remote sensing of type to get soil moisture in order to approximate the temperature. So this is a big issue actually for measuring the temperature. It's not something easy. It is still a part of research. So it's not something operational until now. Thermal infrared is an input to model variables like evapotranspiration or water stress that needs some model about the functioning of the vegetation in order to do. So now I move to the last forms of remote sensing, which is based on the same physics, the same principle as thermal remote sensing, but it uses a higher wavelengths. One consequence of using higher wavelengths is that we don't have the problem with clouds, but the spatial resolution is very much lower. Each pixel will be 10 to 25 kilometers depending on the sensor. Here I put a list of names of sensors working as passive microwave, TRMM for precipitation, SSMI, SMOS, AMSR. And so one application I want to expose is it would be based on AMSR-E that works in at different wavelengths, and I will talk about 10 gigahertz, so about 3 centimeters wavelengths. And at this wavelengths, the emissivity is 0.4 for water, 0.95 for young ice, and 0.85 for old ice. So it means because emissivity is smaller for seawater, the quantity of energy that is emitted by water is much smaller than for ice, for young or for old ice. And what is the parameter that is derived from the Planck's law? It was called the brightness temperature. So let's go back to the equation. The brightness temperature is the temperature you can derive by using this equation. So you measure this quantity, you know the wavelengths, so you can derive the temperature. When you do that, it's like you consider the emissivity is equal to 1. You know it's not true, but you do it. You know emissivity is not 1, but we apply it. So we derive one temperature, which is not the surface temperature, but because we pretend that emissivity is equal to 1, it's not 1, but we pretend it, we call this temperature the brightness temperature. So the brightness temperature is the temperature we can derive from using the Planck's law by making the approximation that emissivity is equal to 1. So basically, we measure a certain quantity of energy coming from the different surface here, surface type here. We use the Planck's law, we derive the brightness temperature. And the brightness temperature is equal to 110 Kelvin for the seawater and about 200 something Kelvin for the ice. Here, at this interface, close to the Arctic Circle, for example, at this interface, the temperature is more or less the same for sea, ice, about 0 degrees Celsius, 173 Kelvin. So this is the actual temperature, but the brightness temperature is different. And so what we can see here is a map of this brightness temperature at this wavelength. And what you can see here in the Arctic Ocean is that the brightness temperature here is about 230 degrees Kelvin, and here it's about 210. This is a very efficient way to say where is the ice. The ice is where the brightness temperature is much higher than the sea water. So this is to explain this difference. Here, when you go across the equator, you can see the temperature is higher here and here. Here you have liquid water wherever, but the temperature of the ocean surface is different. So the gradients here are related to the temperature of water, but the gradients here are related to the gradients in the state of the water between liquid water or solid water. So basically, once again, this is done as a routine. Every day, we can have some maps of the presence of snow based of ice, sorry, over the Arctic Ocean. So we can have a map of where is the snow, of where is the ice. And actually, we have better than that. We have different colors here that are related to the fraction of the pixel that is covered by ice, which means at some transition places, we can have a little bit less concentration than at the heart of the ice shelf. This data is routinely produced and freely accessible. It is interpreted as ice concentration in terms of surface. So it tells you 100% of the pixel is covered by ice. In terms of research, some people use the same principle to study the seasonal variation of the presence of ice over some big lakes, like here in Canada. And what you can see is the seasonal variation of the brightness temperature over this lake. Here, what you see when the brightness temperature in when the lake is when there is some ice at the top of the lake. And here is a spring. It is a transition from solid water, ice, to liquid water. So you can see very precisely the moment at which, the period during which the ice is melting. And similarly, you can monitor the date at which the lake become ice. So you can do it routinely. And you can map the timing of the appearance of ice or the disappearance of ice. Some other examples about what we can do with this passive microwave. For example, what can be done is to estimate the snow depths. This is approximately working over flat areas like Siberia, but it's not working when there are mountains. The signal is totally disturbed by the topography. Another thing is it can be used also to monitor the temperature of ocean. So this is complementary to the thermal remote sensing in this case. Maybe I need more 5 minutes to complete. It's okay for everyone?
I guess that some people already left, but I guess you can also take 5 minutes and hopefully, yeah, Cecile is fine with that. So if Cecile is okay, then we should continue for 5 more minutes. And Ismail is still there, so I'm sure it's good.
So the last application about passive microwave is the measurement of soil moisture. The emissivity of soil depends on the soil moisture. So it means humid soil have got an emissivity that is weaker, that is smaller than dry soil. So it means this soil and this soil, the same soil that receives, the second one receives some rain, emits less energy than this one. So the brightness temperature of this one is smaller than this one. So if we look at some passive microwave signal of the same territory at 2 different dates, separated only by 3 days, and here there have been some rain. what you can see is the impact of the rain. The soil here emits much less energy than previously when it was dry. And this is the reason why some satellites have been designed is to measure the soil moisture. Like SMOS is a satellite that has been developed at CESBio, where Laurent Polidori, you met Laurent Polidori a few weeks ago. So SMOS is a satellite that relies on this principle. It's using a big wavelength of 21 centimeters to decrease the disturbance by vegetation. It's got a low spatial resolution, 25 kilometers, but it has been designed to measure the soil moisture. And approximately on the same principle, it can also map the ocean salinity. And here is some measurement, some images, some raw images of SMOS over Scandinavia. And these images, this data, the brightness temperature measured by SMOS is used as an input in some simulators together with auxiliary data like meteorological data from the European Center for Meteorological Forecast, fraction of land cover, a lot of data, and it is used to produce soil moisture estimate like in these pictures. Like the water is expressed as a cubic meter of water for cubic meter of soil. So basically, yes. On thermal, first conclusion on thermal and passive microwave remote sensing. I don't give here a list of applications. I'm unable to do a complete list of applications for that. There is a lot more, but I hope you saw the main principles of the measurements. The raw and processed data are totally available. Of course, using the raw data require to fully understand the physical principle and also to have some idea how to develop, how to interpret that. So I recommend to use the process data because a lot of process data are already available. And the surface temperature from Landsat thermal band is uncertain because of emissivity. There is no consensus on the methodology to derive the surface temperature from such spectral band. And as a conclusion for this first lecture, these different forms of remote sensing offer some complementary pieces of information. Most of the data is freely available, except some radar data. A big part of it is free, but not everything. And some high-resolution optical data. This is also not free. Most data are provided at various levels of processing, from raw to thematic. And in my presentation, even though I gave a sort of long list of different types of remote sensing, I think I'm still lacking a part of it, and especially the remote sensing of precipitations and water vapor, for example, in the atmosphere. So this I will not present. So this is finished. Maybe you have questions.
So are there questions? Of course, it's already updated and some people have to go for other stuff, but so.
Maybe just a short question.
Yes.
Just about the last example about soil moisture and the difference in emissivity. I didn't get how to consider the influence of the vegetation cover. So how do you differentiate between the soil moisture alone and the role of the vegetation?
The main source the main source of information to consider it is the fact that this satellite uses a wavelength at 21 centimeters, and at 21 centimeters, leaves, grass, and small branches do not influence the signal. Only the big branches and the trunks will. So basically, that simplifies quite a lot of problem.
Okay.
Though it's necessary to know if we have a forest or not, if we have some trees or not. So it means we need to have the fraction of land cover within the 25 kilometers pixel in order to make a different model of attenuation by the soil, by the trees and the big branches.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so if there is no like question that oh no,
yeah, I have another question if there is no other questions, and it's related to the last answer. I guess then for LiDAR, you mentioned also that you can specify, you can use a very specific wavelength. So could you tell a little bit more what would be the choices of this wavelengths, especially for those kind of questions, if you want to better differentiate the type of vegetation, to make sure that the pulse goes through all the vegetation to go very deep in the ground. Do you play with the wavelengths that you use then in the LiDAR?
For the LiDAR,
yeah.
For the LiDAR, each LiDAR works in only one wavelength. So the user don't choose it. It's only the maker of the LiDAR that choose it. So if we want to have a LiDAR for vegetation, for me the best choice is to use a LiDAR in the near infrared wavelength, because vegetation reflects a lot this wavelength.
Okay. So then it depends on the LiDAR you buy.
Yeah, because LiDAR rely on laser, and laser you can have laser with quite different wavelengths, from blue to green to red to near infrared. But as far as I know, for remote sensing, LiDAR use almost mostly near infrared laser.
Okay.
Because it's quite efficient for this purpose, for vegetation.
Thank you.
I don't know if I should close the session or not. I have one constraint, which is that I have to pick my kids, so I have to close the session at some point. But maybe if still I do have a question, and maybe some other people have questions, and maybe we can raise them at the beginning of next session on Thursday, if you agree, Nicolas.
Yeah, yes, of course. Perfect.
So that we can both pick our kids and get the answer to the question.
Yes.
So, Nicolas, thank you very much for your first and very interesting lecture, and so we resume on Thursday for the second of the 6 sessions. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks, Nicolas.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.